Thank you all very much. Sorry about the ridiculously overblown biography. It's very difficult to know how much to put in and how much not. Today I'm going to talk about a particular case study in the history of 20th century nationalism, which is the emergence and then very sudden disappearance of Yiddish language culture in the Soviet Union. In particular, my own training is as a musicologist, and I work on classical and vernacular musics. And what I'm particularly interested in thinking about here is why it is that there is a commonplace in European and North American Soviet Jewry, scholarship on Soviet Jewry, to foreground the adverse political context under which Soviet Jewry laboured during the Stalin period. Now, there's nothing controversial about recognising that, of course, and we're all familiar with that history. Those of us who work on the Soviet Union know about the increasing anti-Semitism of the Stalin regime, particularly after the Second World War, the famous Doctor's Plot, the Night of the Murdered Poets, and so on. But I want to look at a slightly different narrative, which is a particular kind of state-sponsored narrative about nationality in relation to another imagination of the global, which is the Soviet Union itself, which imagined itself as a kind of alternative global space in many ways. So we saw in several presentations today, particularly a presentation from this morning, about the idea of Russia as a kind of mnogonationalny state, which is to say a multinational state, and in a way that draws on a history that goes right the way back to the emergence of the Soviet Union. So Yiddish in the Soviet Union was the only place in the world where it was recognized as an official language. In fact, even to this day, there is a country or a space far east of the old Soviet Union, now part of the Russian Federation, called Biddle, often referred to as the autonomous Jewish oblast, where Yiddish is still an official language. It's the only state in the world where Yiddish has a national status, if you like. In the early years of the Soviet Union, Yiddish was identified as the language of the Jewish proletariat. This is part of Lenin and then Stalin's idea of trying to put in place a secular alternative to the idea of Zionism, a secular, if you like, a Soviet alternative, referred to in Yiddish as the weltliche Zion, or the secular Zion of Birobidzhan, which was eventually founded as a state under Stalin in the early to mid-30s. So the official Yiddish language secular culture was afforded every support by the state, even in the early years of Stalin, and a wide range of Yiddish language cultural institutions thrived under Soviet recognition. Many of these were vernacular cultural institutions. For example, there was a national folk ensemble, there were folk publications, Yiddish was standardized and certain spelling rules were put in place. They did away with the old Hebrew spelling system in Yiddish and normalized spelling according to a phonetic system. They did away with special final syllable, final end of word or final forms. There are 5 of them in Yiddish and Hebrew, it's the same alphabet. So one of the things we can say that the Soviet Union in its early years represented a space where Yiddish language culture, particularly vernacular Yiddish language culture, could thrive in stark contrast to the difficulties it faced in Eastern Europe. Okay, so in the Soviet Union then, we can say that the traditional historiography of Yiddish is a kind of double renaissance around a kind of very problematic middle period. And that middle period is the so-called Stalin period. And my argument is that without wanting to undermine the dangers of living under Stalin as a Jew, nonetheless, state policy towards Jewishness, particularly secular Jewishness, was very favorable right the way until the post-war period. So there was an establishment of secular Jewish Yiddish language schools, state-sponsored Yiddish theatre. The Moscow theatre remained open right the way through the Second World War, right the way into the late 60s. And what's really interesting from my point of view is that there was extensive ethnographic research on Yiddish language culture, particularly Jewish folklore, music, and so on. Much of this work was published bilingually in Yiddish and Russian, and some of it was published in Russian only, but it's an enormous body of work, something like 10 to 15,000 volumes of work on Yiddish language culture in this period, one of the largest collections of work of its kind. The second Renaissance, so-called, is the so-called Khrushchev period, where new journals were introduced, so-called Sowjetisch Heimland, in Yiddish the Soviet homeland, and new versions of original so-called classic Yiddish authors appeared, and so on. But what I want to talk about really is this period in the 30s and 40s of this extensive ethnographic attempt to capture the idea of the Yiddish nation. Stalin himself, just after the revolution, was appointed Commissar for the Nationalities. He developed, based on his own pre-revolutionary writings, a theory of nation, Nationalist, and he developed this concept in particular of a non-territorial nation. And of course this is very important for Yiddish, having a complex relationship with territory. You remember that under the Russian Empire, Yiddish speakers and Jews were forced onto the western fringe of the empire, into what in Yiddish was called the Tchum HaMoshev, but we now call the Pale of Settlements, this area where Jews had to live in very small towns. This is where we get the word shtetl from. So the Yiddish word comes from the word stott in Yiddish, which means town. Shtetl is the diminutive, plural shtetler, in case you're wondering. And the shtetler with this site of late 19th, early 20th century flowerings of vernacular Yiddish culture, which would then lionized, aggrandized, and idealized under Soviet fictions, also written in Yiddish. In the context of music in particular, there are three figures that are quite important. I think that's how you make it. How do I make it? Something. That's it? No? Oh, I know. Okay, that's just blank. It's all right. I'm just going to point here. These are three very important figures. The first one is Moshe Velikovsky, Lazar Sanitsky, and Itzik Pfeffer. These are three figures did some really important work in collecting Yiddish songs, in particular the Yiddish song corpus. We think in the Soviet Union reached something in the region of 10 to 15,000 songs, which is an enormous body of work. Some of those tunes floated east, if you like, from Eastern Europe, but many of them are autochthonous songs from borrowings from Russian and Ukrainian cultural songs. For example, the great song that we always think of as quintessentially Jewish, which is Hava Nagila, obviously a Hebrew title, is originally a Ukrainian dance song, and is not Jewish at all. At least the tune is. It became. I mean, who owns a tune is a whole other question, which I really don't want to get into now. But in the context of thinking about nations, nationalism, and ideas of the relationship between, if you like, diasporic cultures and nationalities, I think what's interesting here is to see the intensity of the work of these ethnographic committees in trying to collect this cultural heritage together. There's a sense of a kind of administrative urge at work here. A lot of that work was also making audio recordings. So what I've got here is a recording which hopefully you'll be able to hear. So bear with me a second. And I'm just going to, let's see if this is loud enough for you. What's that? an example, the Freile, which is a particular form that circulates in the Jewish Yiddish language musical tradition called klezmer. Klezmer is an Eastern European and Western Russian cultural form, usually played at weddings, very closely related to Svatibaska muzika in Bulgaria, and similar traditions in Roma communities, where there's an awful lot of cross-sharing of melodies and cultural forms. Okay, so what's interesting in all of this is, as I've said, the intensity of the ethnographic program. And what's interesting in particular is that ethnography we tend to think of as focused very much on the local, on small scale. And yet under the Soviet system, ethnography, ethnografia, exactly the same word in Yiddish and in Russian, focused on the idea of trying to construct a cultural nation. And it didn't matter, particularly under the official discourse of Stalin, whether that nation had a territory or not. In other words, this idea of an idealized space in which cultural processes and practices circulated. So some of the Jews were, by now, had moved right to the far, I'm going to do it backwards so you can see where I'm going. If you imagine I'm Russia, not quite fat enough, but you give me more of those cakes and I might get to it. So on the western edge of Russia here, you have the so-called metropolitan fringe, Moscow, St. Petersburg, and so on. Very intense focus of about 2.5 to 3 million Yiddish speakers. And then in the far east, about another 1 million Yiddish speakers. An enormous number of Jews who never lived in Biddle before were moved there. They were encouraged to move there with offers of land and so on. So you have this interesting kind of radical dislocation of two different kinds of Yiddish language culture, which nonetheless continue to exchange intimately their cultural products through this vast interior. One of the great, if you like, what's the word I'm looking for, achievements of the Soviet Union. So I'm going to I realise I'm running out of time now. So music's place in Soviet ethnography is crucial because it constitutes evidence of what we might call the affective life of citizens living in an imaginary or cultural nation that is not bounded by a particular territory. And this is interesting from our own conception of citizenship, the idea that nationalism does not necessarily need to be a place bound to a particular geography. It can be an imaginary geography. So global citizenship might be something that is built on these kinds of models. And I know the Soviet history of how Jews are treated is very problematic, but nonetheless, let's try to get beyond that and think about, let's look in our own histories for models of thinking about citizenship that does away with this destructive binarism, nation, globe, and think about something other than that model. Okay. So music in particular then offers us evidence of the emotional life of these Yiddish-speaking Jews, and it's a key resource in constructing notions of nationality, narodnost or nationalist. Nationalist was Stalin's preferred term, which is, of course, is a borrowing, and it's a neologism kind of built on top of nationality. Must in Russian is the like ness or iti in English. Yeah, it's that kind of abstraction suffix. And we can say that this process is also a key part of folklore revivalism. So the early years of the Soviet Union, particularly the early years under Stalin, were all about trying to normalize and administer working class or folkloric cultures to make that kind of normative, the so-called, this is Trotsky's, if you like, the domination of the working class, by the working class, for the working class, and so on. In other nations within the Soviet Union, they also utilized music as a resource for a marking of difference. So every nation was equivalent to every other nation, whether it was territorial or non-territorial. They each had their own folk ensemble, their own folk choir, their own folk theatre, their own public set of publication. There was a kind of formula. And this is why Yiddish flourished, because of this rather administered and slightly, if you like, abstracted notion of how a nation should present itself to itself. And I'm nearly finished now. So in particular, Yiddish emerges as a key resource in this process. It stands as a vernacular against, for example, the Zionist predilection for Hebrew, and of course other kinds of predilections for Russian. It stands as this middle ground between completely alien ideology and internal exotic others. And for a while, Yiddish served the function of producing a productive, liminal, in-between space that was very helpful to the Bolsheviks. Okay, so that's everything I wanted to say. Thank you all very much. I realised if I'd gone on to the next bit, I would have gone on for too long. And I always had too many slides, so I thought better stop there. Thank you.
Any questions? Yes, please.
I just want to make a comment that your presentation brought out to me is how nationalism is so seductive and how this effective part of it is a part of its appeal.
Yeah.
You have the music, you have the language, the food, the memories, the shared stories.
Yes.
And that is what I think we're lacking when we talk about global citizenship. Where's that effective part?
That's it. And for me, one of the reasons I was so interested by your paper earlier, Professor paper was for me so resonant precisely because it began with this question of, the effective seduction of nationalism. And I think part of what's interesting about early Bolshevik policy is it recognizes this seductive quality and seeks to organize it. I'm not suggesting it's a model by any means, but it's this recognition, smart recognition, that if they were able to present themselves to linguistic others, to the Russian mainstream, as liberating them from a Russian dominance, again goes back to this exactly kind of discourse that Professor Annie was talking about, then they could represent themselves as a force that other parts of the Soviet Empire wanted to support because it was in their interest to do so. A very interesting and thoughtful move, and the fact of this investment in ethnography, enormous investment. There was something like 15 to 20,000 ethnographers being paid in the first 5 years of the Soviet Union to go around all the nations and to take stock of these nationalities' cultures. It's an extraordinary program. Enormous body of work, which we barely started to look at.
Yeah, so just to comment on how global citizenship could draw music as well, just to comment that already if you look at globalcitizen.org and similar organizations, they're already using one of the big drawings for people to get involved is to do their good deeds online, and then they can come to these music festivals,
yes.
where you see almost messianic narratives.
That's right.
We're all getting together, we're all great, we've done our charity work, and here we've got Obama speaking, or we've got this, or we've got that. And music is part of it, but it's not a particular music stand.
Yes, but that's right.
There are musical events where you have this kind of sense of belonging.
Yeah, that kind of charismatic use of music.
Yes.
And again, that goes right way back to, Schiller and Herder, that whole notion of a need for a charismatic representation of some ideal, whatever that might be. And the more empty it is and the more malleable it is, the more powerful it is.
Can I just add that it reminds me a bit of the sort of diasporic aspects of folk music, like Irish music in America, for example, where it's used to sort of underpin something of a sort of police aspect. People in...
It's interesting, the biggest place where klezmer in Europe is being heard now is in Germany. It's huge.
Is that right?
It's absolutely huge. Germany is certainly the biggest centre, Berlin, but also Krakow in Poland. So, but Krakow makes sense. Berlin?
Yes.
Not so much. There wasn't a very large Yiddish-speaking community living in Berlin until the very late 19th century, so it doesn't have a long tradition. So it's a sort of an invented tradition, where largely produced by German-speaking rather than Yiddish-speaking Jews.
Again, thanks for a very fascinating paper and a lot of knowledge for us. Could you say something more about what's specific about music that lends itself to this? I'm very curious about that. And secondly, what is the situation in the autonomous region of Oblast now?
Okay, that's a very good question.
I know it's not part of your thing, but I'm just
it's not
curious.
rosy, I can tell you that. But to answer your first question, that would require a whole conference. But my sense is that what music allows us to do is to identify with musical shapes and emotional kind of cues which we think we know what it means. It seems to speak to us in a language that exceeds our ability to describe it, and therefore it comes to us as if it were meaningful. That's certainly how it works in the European narrative. There are, of course, I don't want to universalize, I'm just talking about European narrative in particular. There is this notion in European constructions of what music is and what it does, that it somehow exceeds the specific. I don't like the universalist narrative, but it certainly muddies the specific a little bit. I mean, this idea that these tunes move from one place to another. A really good example is the Dutch national anthem, which which is one of the oldest national anthems. It's a 17th century tune, maybe even a 16th century tune, but actually its origin is a Catholic tune from France, which runs very counter to the origins of the first usage of the Dutch tune in the Dutch Republic, which of course was not Catholic by any means. And so, you know, you have this transferability, so the materials can move from one place to another. And we are, of course, also entrained to understand certain musical phrases to mean something. So, falling first, we tend to think of as weeping or sighing. I mean, it's completely metaphorical, it's culturally constructed, but we have become entrained to hear things in these ways. So, music seems to give us some kind of access to an abstracted, affective order. So I mean, Zizek does a really interesting little moment in The Pervert's Guide to Ideology, where he talks about the use of Beethoven in Clockwork Orange. And he says that the reason it's meaningful is because it's empty. It's completely empty, and you can pour your own ideology into it. So he's talked about its use in North Korea as the national anthem, so-called the anthem for the European Union, but also it was used constantly by the Nazis. It's been used on the left and on the right. It was played constantly during the Soviet Union period, particularly during the Stalin-Hitler Pact, blah, 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 blah. So it's that emptiness, I think, as much as anything, that it begs the question of the affective for us. It doesn't answer it, but it begs it. It draws our attention to it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And now we have a presentation from Stefan Pedersen. Stefan Pedersen is a political theorist specializing in global political theory, ideology studies, and world politics, and he's particularly interested in the study of dynamic relationships involving interactions between all history fields, both historically and presently. He holds a recent PhD in political theory from the University of Leeds, where he currently works as a teaching assistant. He has taught extensively in various political theory and international relationship models there, and his chapter, Kantian and Welschian Cosmopolitanism and Critical Distinction, was published in the anthology Cosmopolitanism Without Foundations, edited by Tamara Paris and Dan Letzer. So, listen.
Okay, thank you. It's interesting that the last speaker mentioned Clockwork Orange, because my starting off point for his presentation is scene from the end of the 2001 Space Odyssey, which I'm using here to show you the birth of the global imaginary, or something that's been theorized as happening during the 20th century, and especially in the second half of the 20th century, where this fetus in orbit represents humanity entering a next stage of its evolutionary journey. So it goes from being, just seeing the Earth as just what you're standing on, basically the territory that your group belongs to, and it's now beginning to see that it's actually landlocked on this planet, which gives us a more unitary perspective on who we are as human beings, that we belong to the same place. And let's see. So that image of the star child, which is called, is one of the first iconic artistic illustrations that's dealing with this sudden planetary awareness that humanity experienced due to images recorded by these rockets and satellites that came with the space age in the 50s and especially in the 60s. And this space age coincided with also the global and cultural periods, especially connected to what we think of as the events of 1968, and where you have this sudden student movement awakening almost revival around the globe. And one of the theorists that studied 1968 most closely, he sees George Katsiafikis. He sees this as the 1968 as a turning point, a pivotal point in the evolution of the human consciousness in a sense. He says that 1968 marked the end of an epoch, while it also marked the first active and unfolding species consciousness, which is the initial emergence of a new global culture, a global we. So this is something that is, we can say that this awareness was something that began very early in, let's say, 1492 with Columbus finding America and realizing, we were around the planet and so on. But especially since the 60s, we have become accustomed to images of this. This is the first color photography of the planet. So in a sense, the fact that we live on the planet was something we had to infer before. A similar image was taken a few years before this, that was very grainy and didn't have the same cultural impact. But this is a photograph taken from one of the lunar missions before the moon landing, where you just orbited the moon. And on the way back, I think it was Earth, they were able to take the picture. And it's an iconic picture called Earthrise, and this coincides with the same year that movie was first shown. And this is an even more iconic picture, I think, the Blue Marble, which is one of the first pictures that's taken on the way back from the moon, I think. Where it actually gets so far away from the planet that you can see the whole thing, but close enough that you're able to distinguish certain features. So this is South Africa haircut. I mean, you've seen these pictures before. But the thing is that what we often see is images that's created, artistic depictions, and so on. But I mean, this is empirical reality when it's a photograph taken by a human being with a camera. And here's another one from the International Space Station, which is taken just a few years ago. And I'm not sure if it's as easy to see, but this is Ireland right here, Scotland, England, the Aurora Borealis towards the North Pole, some Norwegian cities on the side here. And if you zoom in a little bit, Dora should be located right here. So as you see, there's no borders that's visible from space, but lots of human habitation. I mean, you can see all these lights from cities. And Manfred B. Steger has theorized that humanity is experiencing this transition from what used to be a national imaginary towards a new global imaginary. And the global imaginary is something that is starting to affect the way we think about our political place and so forth. And this is just a recent survey that was done, where it basically repeats one of the questions that we just had in the workshop session. So, will you consider yourself a global citizen? And the yes ones are these, dark blue ones on this side. And it's overwhelmingly for people in the US, the UK, South Africa, India, Germany, China, Brazil, and Australia consider themselves global citizens, in addition to a citizen of your country, was a very good question. So this is fertile ground, I would say, for an ideology, for instance, that appeals to a common humanity instead of using the national as the talking point of political actions. Okay, and now I'm going to explain the difference between what I think is a neglected viewpoint, which is I call planetarist cosmopolitanism, and what we're used to. So, these pictures I just showed you is beginning to have an impact on what kind of ideological narratives people are going to accept as relevant to the way they know reality. So in short, nationalism is starting to lose hold, and global alternatives are being forced to meet the demand for more expansive collective narratives. And as a result, we are now, according to many pundits in the New York Times, for instance, so forth, presented with a stark choice between nationalist and globalist ideologies. But I will in this presentation argue that this nationalist-globalist dichotomy is a misleading representation of the actual range of choice in front of us, in that it both exaggerates the conceptual divide between the nationalists and the globalists, while it also completely obscures the most promising ideological alternative for the long term that is presently on the menu. So, this singularity of our planetary habitats that's evident in these pictures has also been amplified by the recent realization that industrialization on a global civilizational scale has shifted the planet into the Anthropocene, this proposed new geological epoch where actions as a technological species are recognized as having an ongoing negative impact on the carrying capacity of the Earth. So in short, the planetary civilization of humanity has become the community whose fortunes we will either prosper or perish along with. It is a community that will have to be politically consolidated if we are to secure it. This is what I'm arguing here. And the continued adherence to the national people as the locus of our political allegiance works directly counter to the completion of what appears a necessary transition if our species is to survive and thrive in the long term. So it is becoming increasingly evident for even the casual observer that human civilization as a whole is infused with an actual existing three-dimensional spherical boundary that is basically located where the atmosphere of our planet blurs into outer space. And that's the boundary that we have to deal with, not the one between countries. This is the one that really counts, if you accept the global imaginary and the impact given human actions as that's on the ecosystem or the whole, and so forth. And due to all this, one should think that a comprehensive program for achieving full world integration had been articulated by now, but surprisingly little progress has been achieved in this respect since globalism first gained prominence in intellectual circles during the interwar years. The thing is that most mid-century globalists, because this was a discourse before World War II, during World War II, how to create a global society that ended up in the United Nations and so forth, is that all these intellectuals envisage constructing a new stand states, limiting their power without abolishing them, as Paul Rosenbaum said in a recent study of the subject. And this oversight that you have a global system center of nation states is something H.G. Wells, the famous science fiction author, pointed out on numerous occasions would actually void science. And that has brought us to the present time where outspoken nationalists currently occupy the majority of seats in the United Nations Security Council, which is humanity's highest political institution. So this design flaw is one of the chief reasons why the global institutional system is now experiencing what David Howell and others have called the gridlock. And that's where Planetarist cosmopolitanism comes in. Because a close student of the work of H.G. Wells, the historian and futurist W. Ward Wager, noticed the ideological basis for the failure of the current system, and to cite him, as nationalism demands unqualified loyalty to the nations, Marxism to the working class, and Christianity to its biblical God, so cosmopolitanism, the ideology of world integration, will have to demand unqualified loyalty to mankind against the claims of all segmental polities, tribes, and churches. So if you want to have a cohesive cosmopolitanism, you have to you can't combine that with loyalty to the nation state. You have to be loyal to mankind, basically. So it's sort of, you either do it properly or you don't do it at all, basically, is what H.G. Wells and probably Warren Weber was arguing. And if you look at Brexit and the way the United Nations work at the moment, I think that is, they were pretty much right about that. So Wager again says that logically, cosmopolitanism should be a program for creating a new culture, not for patching up the old cultures. It should be for integrating for creating an integrated world commonwealth, not for spinning a denser web of treaties among the old states. And this is what I say, what I call planetarist cosmopolitanism. That is truly global in the sense that it doesn't leave any space for nationalism at all. It's the opposite of nationalism. And that is not the way people in general think about what we call globalism or cosmopolitanism these days. Because globalism or cosmopolitanism, as it's currently presented by very famous theorists like, for instance, Martha Nussbaum, who have this Kantian view of international cooperation as the ideal. They are, we have thought internationalist cosmopolitans, and they still rely on international view of the world, basically, which is grounded in the nation state. And the moment you ground the political world order in the nation state, you have made it impossible to have a truly global polity, because you preserve these divisions that can be abused or used by people like Farage and so on. You're leaving an opening up that will destroy the system unless you have progressive internationalists in power all the time. So you're creating a systemic failure, basically, because nationalism is a coherent system where you have the people, the state, so you have the people, the state, and the nations in a coherent whole. If you think of planetarism as the dichotomous opposite, it has humanity as its basis. You have to envision a sort of planetary polity that would take the role of the state in a sense, and the earth as the habitat of humanity instead of the nation. And that is a coherent whole, I would argue. But internationalists, cosmopolitans, still rely on the nation state and the people. So it's like peoples would be the ethical basis or a sort of foundation. International organizations composed of nation states, representatives is what you have instead of an actual sovereign entity. And these nation state representatives are the first acting within a singular people, so you create divisions straight away. So, to make a long story short, there's a continent, which I'm describing here, where we are currently, at best, working on internationalism, even the cosmopolitan discourse, which is not a paradigm on its own, because it doesn't have this, it's not a coherent structure if you look at the conceptual foundation for it. Planetarism is an alternative that does have a cohesive structure, and it's paradigmatic opposite of nationalism. But to get from internationalism to planetarism, we would have to abandon the foundation from the national people. So that's a big ask. But if you want to talk about global citizenship, I think you would have to decide to either, you have to make a decision if you're either a nationalist at heart or a planetarist at heart. Thanks.